I'm Suman. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Marco. Marco helps companies connect their people in a time when it's more difficult to do that through experiences, intentional experiences that could be virtually, in person, through multi-day offsites. And we're building products to support employee connection. And here we have Arthur Woods, who I've met a couple of times now. But Arthur, how are you doing on this Friday afternoon?
Good, Suman. This is awesome. It's great to be here. Great to hang out with you, and I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Well, let's start with like how you came in here, and apparently you're a popular guy because you know a couple of folks here. So for context, my friend Ben, this is his apartment/podcast studio.
Yep.
And I walk in with Arthur, and he's like, "How do I get into the apartment?" You happen to know, I guess, both of the folks here, so maybe.
Yeah. Well, first of all, future of podcasting is live, work, cold plunge. I'm learning now.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's like do everything in one place. I'm loving it. The versatility of a space.
Yes.
But I think today we were reminded, and this is testament to Marco's mission. But I think we're reminded that the entrepreneurial community is very small.
Yes.
And tight.
So be nice to everyone.
Yeah, be nice to everyone because you never know where you show up and you might be recording a podcast.
Yeah, exactly.
You don't want to get kicked out. But yeah, we learned upon arrival that we have a bunch of mutual friends, and Lisa, who's here, recording a Bad Bitch Empire podcast, and Ben, of course, who owns the place. So this is cool.
So I think I was doing a little research this morning, and I think the theme of this episode, well, generally we are trying to interview people who are turning companies into communities, which I think I'm personally passionate about. And I learned that you're, I think, passionate about it in a number of ways. So I think the podcast title perhaps will be How to Be a Superhero at Work.
Love that.
Because I was just listening to this fantastic TED Talk that you did. But perhaps if you give a bit of background about yourself, then I'm going to dive into a couple of different kind of areas. But
Sure. Well, I'll keep it brief. I grew up in a single parent home in Northern California, very conservative evangelical community. I came out halfway through college, had kind of an identity crisis, but discovered firsthand that being part of a community where you feel a sense of belonging is key to who I am. And in many cases in my life, I didn't feel that sense of belonging. I didn't flock to investment banking and consulting where a lot of my peers were going, but I started my first company in college. And I ended up launching a global nonprofit called Out in Tech, which became one of the largest LGBT communities in technology. And then for the last 10 years, built two enterprise SaaS HR companies, one called Imperative, which is a peer-to-peer coaching software, and then another called Matheson, which is a DEI analytics platform. And I've always been of the mind, and I think you and I can geek out a lot on this, that
100%.
Work has been broken for most people. Work is not a place where most people feel a sense of belonging. It's not a place where most people feel psychologically safe. It's not a place where most people are thriving, to be honest. And so I feel like for me, the work that I've been doing has always been, sort of with the mission of making work better for people.
Yeah.
This is something I think we really share.
I agree. Well, could you talk a little bit about in the TED Talk you talked about when you're a kid, you're kind of bright-eyed and I think you said you want to be a superhero, right? And that I think changes once you start looking at the daunting kind of perhaps professional trajectory. Can you say a little bit about that notion?
Yeah. So if we think about like when we're all kids, one of the beautiful things is we don't typically, wake up every day thinking about, sort of scarcity, fear, responsibilities. We sort of have these open dreams of what we can become. It's very expansive. It's very generative. We don't. You ask a kid, what do you want to be when you grow up, and you hear the widest range of things. And the moment we start to enter college and enter adulthood, I think a lot of those dreams kind of get compressed, and scarcity and judgment and sort of responsibility sort of weigh on folks. And I think a lot of folks start to operate from a point of fear and not a point of possibility, And I think work in many cases represents that. Work, the way it's been designed, has not often brought out the best in people. It hasn't been optimized for creativity. It hasn't been optimized for, human flourishing. It's been optimized largely for getting the most out of people and inherently not trusting them. If you really think about it, the way that we've defined most of the metrics in work, it's been inherently from this position of, our people are likely not working, so we need to make sure they are,
Yeah. One, I'm sure you're familiar with the concept of ikigai.
Yes,
but,
of course.
Yeah, I actually used that kind of some of your words in a conversation that I was having with a coworker today. and I was talking about kind of what are your passions and what are your kind of superpowers, or perhaps what do you want to be your superpowers. And I guess just quickly, Ikigai is, I guess it's the Venn diagram of what you're good at, what the world needs, what you can get paid for, and then what's the other one?
What brings you joy?
What brings you joy, right?
Yeah.
So I think it's really interesting to think about. And your first startup, which remind me of the name of the
Imperative.
Imperative.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
could you talk a little bit about the genesis of that? And I think there's the story around kind of volunteering perhaps gave people the most joy in their job, and how did they bring that 5 hours per week into more, or 5 hours per month into their life? Maybe share that story a bit.
Yeah, so I left Google and started a company and ended up getting introduced to my future co-founder of this company, Imperative. And Aaron Hurst was the founder of an organization called the Taproot Foundation.
Okay.
And Taproot really kind of pioneered the pro bono service movement. So what they realized was, you're a lawyer, you have amazing skills that the nonprofit and social impact community could use. Why don't you take those skills and apply them? Don't just go and paint a school. Maybe apply your actual skill sets to the professional services that a lot of organizations need. And they created this model, and probably as no surprise, the lawyers and many professionals that donated their time and their skills to the community got so much more purpose from that work than they did their paycheck jobs.
Yeah.
So people would go and, just put hours and hours, thousands of hours into their pro bono work, and they'd say, wow, I wish all work could feel like this.
Yeah.
And what Aaron really brilliantly realized and ended up writing a book, around, was this idea that work is lacking purpose. And, many people do flock to pro bono and things outside of work to find their sense of purpose. And his vision, and I think our vision together, was how can we make all work feel like pro bono work? You shouldn't have to leave your paycheck job to experience that sense of purpose.
Yeah, we're doing an exec retreat next week. I'm gonna, if you're down, invite you to come hang out with us.
Yeah,
and
of
maybe we
course,
can do
of
a purpose
course.
session.
Yeah.
So this isn't chronological order, but I mean, just to quickly, personally, I worked in consulting. Don't hold it against me. And then
No, not at all.
And then I worked in finance, and I was working at SoftBank in this investing job that I ended up not finding a ton of purpose in, and finding more interest in entrepreneurship. But I always love this concept around there's like work-life balance, and how do you meld those three, because you're so busy in challenging jobs. And it seems like you're passionate about this. And one of my old bosses, Jeff Hausenbold, he's the CEO of Shutterfly, and he was at SoftBank, and he talked about doing good while doing good. And this isn't chronological, but I know you were at Google and you worked on YouTube education because you were passionate about that. Why were you passionate about kind of education?
Well, I mean, going back to this sense of purpose, I got to Google, and I knew Google as a place where, it's sort of the happiest place on earth for work, right?
Yeah.
That was one of the reasons I went. I had been an entrepreneur. I said, if I'm going to go get a corporate job, it's got to be at a place like Google. And honestly, Suman, I got there, and 6 months in, I wasn't feeling a sense of purpose. The Willy Wonka bikes, the lunches, and the wellness, facilities all kind of, wore off. And I realized that the nature of the work that I'm doing isn't fulfilling to me.
Yeah.
And so what I did, and actually I sat down with a mentor, and I'll never forget this story. He sat me down and he said, as an entrepreneur, you inherently find purpose in your work because you're building what you're doing. Your companies are an expression of your values.
Yeah.
In work, you can be an entrepreneur. You have the mindset of an entrepreneur wherever you are, even if you're in a big corporation. So he said, go find purpose as an entrepreneur, bring that mindset to the work that you're doing. And a light bulb went off, and I realized, Google's a big place. There's a lot going on. Go seek out the things that are valuable for the company. It's the Ikigai model. What can I get paid for? Where can I derive joy and meaning? And what does the world need? And so I ended up volunteering, moonlighting literally at YouTube on nights and weekends. There was one person who was doing educational work, and I became her second hand, and we built out a team together, and ended up it became a department. And our whole goal was to democratize YouTube's educational content for everyone in the world. Yeah. Unblock YouTube's educational content in schools so kids can learn and not just only watch cat videos when they're in school. And it was a really great, it was a great reminder for me that as entrepreneurs, we do bring that mindset wherever we are. We might be working in the government, we might be working in a corporation. I imagine at Bain and at SoftBank, you brought an entrepreneurial spirit to the work that you did, right?
Yeah, I certainly tried. And I think good organizations actually allow you to do that.
Yes.
Which is what you just expressed about Google. because what I found in certain jobs, for example, SoftBank, I was very interested in like kind of creating new, perhaps working with companies to create new verticals or being more entrepreneurial. And I figured, what the heck, I could actually go do that full time. But I think the best organizations allow you to. You don't have to be a founder. You can actually express creativity in different ways. That's actually net good for the company. On the subject of net good, a lot of this concept of doing good while doing good, a lot of, I think what you've done, and we'll talk about Matheson is in a second, is around the business value I think you can create by allowing for that expression. Do you think it's possible to find someone, a lot of them, to bring their whole self to work, or whatever the phrase is, and actually have that good for the economics of a company?
I totally believe so. And I think I'm preaching to the choir here, but I think that that's the pathway to achieving business success today. A lot of organizations have, I think, taken advantage of their people, have not necessarily focused on the well-being and purpose of their workforce. And they've sort of just seen the relationship with their people as transactional. I think the new era that we're entering of work is, you will create the greatest loyalty, the greatest output, and I think long-term relationship with your people if you're investing in their well-being, and you're enabling them to all have a sense of ownership in their work every day. We know that the command and control fear-based model for work is broken, and it's not going to last.
How do you think about that in the context of 80% of companies are now remote or hybrid, so it's harder to have just natural connections. And what you're describing is like feeling the sense of belonging, right, at a company. Maybe speak a little bit to the challenges that perhaps you've seen now in this more distributed world around like creating community.
Well, it's really interesting. I mean, so the pandemic thrust us into a new mode of work that I think many people didn't believe was possible. Yeah. Right. I mean, I think if you and I sat down with most leaders 3 years ago, and we were to have told them that, hey, your workforce, the majority of your workforce will be remote and not seeing each other. And you'll onboard new folks and they won't even meet their colleagues.
It'd be from
in
the
person.
sci-fi movie.
People would have said, you're absolutely crazy. There's no way that'll ever happen. And then, of course, it did. I think what happened, and I'd be curious your thoughts on this.
Yeah.
I think what happened is we created an extraordinary accessibility around work when we shifted to remote.
Yeah.
It made it so folks could literally have families at home, care for their pets, not have to commute. But what I think it also did is it left us transacting much more than transforming.
Yeah.
And I see this firsthand. Back-to-back calls. We've crammed way more, meetings into a day. We're entering and leaving. We're not necessarily focused on building rapport.
Yeah.
And I think it's really difficult to build any sort of deep level of trust, especially among leaders, when we're operating with such high velocity of meetings, and they're all about just getting stuff done and not actually building community. Yeah. So I think it speaks to a need for intentionality. Yeah. That we have to acknowledge that there's a need there. We have to really build it into the way that we interact, and it speaks to the need for us to have shared experiences. Yeah. That aren't necessarily just focused on getting work done.
I mean, my view on this is so I would reference a book called The Infinite Game, who Simon Sinek wrote this book, but it was based on a book from the 1960s, and I talk about this quite a bit, but he talks about basically, an infinite game would be like, we want to create a company that kind of helps connects everyone at work. A finite game would be like, hey, we got to hit this next quarter's goals in order to raise our next round, which still exists. Those can coexist, but often actually you might be better suited to actually achieve those short-term goals if you have an infinite mindset. And there's an anecdote where he talks about this guy who worked for Shell, and he came into the company. Shell's an oil and gas company. Yep. They got, and he was the head of this rig. And I'm gonna probably not tell this story perfectly, but he made all the team do these team building exercise, and these are kind of Texan, not necessarily great at emoting folks. Yep. And they built a lot of trust. And the biggest kind of metric that they are graded on is rig time, uptime of rigs. And they had the highest global uptime of rigs. Wow. Because they invested in creating trust and vulnerability.
I believe it.
Which sounds woo-woo. It sounds like, why would you do this? From a business perspective, you could be super efficient. Yeah. And I think there's just trade-off. There's just two sides to every coin. Yeah. Is what we've seen. And the last thing I would say is we see this with our own company, right? Yeah. Our mission is to help connect folks. We're in New York, San Francisco, LA, Miami, Seattle, Atlanta, Boston, Mexico,
Yeah.
Brazil, and the Philippines, and we struggle a lot with this because we are a growing high growth startup, a lot of challenges, and so for us, it's important to do this stuff, and we're by no means perfect at it. So I completely empathize with this, and I would say we talk to people leaders all the time.
Yeah.
Everyone is trying to figure it out.
Everyone is.
Yeah.
The great thing is that there's a need there, and
Yeah.
the nature of what you deliver, it speaks to that need. I have a lot of faith in the leaders that say it's a priority.
Yeah.
The ones I worry about are the ones who say, I don't know why. Let's just have our people get back to work. I don't know why we need to build any sort of safety. By the way, that to me is one of the real wins of the DEIB work
Yeah.
in the last 3 or 4 years. Is that the vernacular, sort of the concept of psychological safety has really like come into
For
our
sure.
vernacular. We're much more aware of the need for safety. The fact that like an employee could have come from a fear-based environment previously and inherently might not raise their hand because they were shot down in their last organization for doing so. So what
Yeah.
are the experiences we're going to create for our people that invite that?
Yeah.
Because as you know, that's the way that we do our best work, and it's the way that we create.
Well, that's somewhat that's what you need to prove, because people are now, especially in this economic environment, they're like, well, like, what's the ROI?
Yeah.
And the ROI actually could be immediate, because then someone might not leave
Yes.
their job that's talented,
Yeah.
and so forth. But sometimes the ROI is harder to prove, because you're like, hey, that person that you might be taking a day off work to kind of like get to know your coworkers.
Right.
But that's going to be super important, because, for example, at Bain, I have people that I've been in weddings of, people that have invested in my company, and vice versa.
Yeah.
And that was all created there. On the subject of DEIB, though, perhaps share a little bit. What is Matheson?
Yeah. So we founded Matheson about 4 years ago now, and really before the DEIB movement took off.
Yeah.
It was an interesting time because we had conceived it. Then the pandemic hit, and then George Floyd murder occurred. It was it was a bit of a roller coaster. But we created a platform to help organizations measure the state of their DEIB efforts. And we one of the things we found is that everyone had a big vision for what they wanted to achieve with DEI.
Yeah.
They had a lot of difficulty quantifying it, and most importantly, they had a lot of difficulty like measuring progress against it.
Yeah.
So 74% of organizations don't set diversity goals.
Really?
Which I was shocked to read.
Yeah.
Only 1 in 4 basically sets diversity goals today. So we created a platform basically to systematize and automate a lot of the manual functions of
Yeah.
tracking your current state of diversity, tracking your programs, policies, setting goals, basically democratizing those goals to your organization, and then reporting out on progress.
Yeah.
And worked with a couple hundred organizations over the course of the last few years to help them really sort of make strides. And many of them, by the way, realized how far behind they were
Yeah.
when the movement really started taking off. Sadly, the DEI work, I think, has hit some serious headwinds this
Yeah.
last year. There's been a record number of layoffs of DEI leaders. I think the work is still inherently misunderstood in many cases. So, I think the goal is to continue fighting the good fight and helping organizations make real progress there. But it's a body of work that I think is still really emerging.
Yeah, it's interesting coming from in past careers. A lot of workplaces I've worked in have been kind of homogenous, not only just objectively homogenous, but in terms of the types of work people do. And now I'm in a company where people do a lot of different things and are from different backgrounds. And I think what you realize is there's a lot of business value created through diversity of people and thought.
Yeah.
Which I think is, and also what you said is like quantifying it through software. It's like there's actually solutions that can empower people to make better decisions, which is
I
super
agree.
cool.
I agree. What I think we're going to see now is that there's a bifurcation of the companies and organizations that are really committed to this work and the ones that aren't.
Yeah.
And I think the ones that are committed, by the way, are of the same ilk of the folks that say these transformational shared experiences are critical to our success. They're
Yeah.
the Marco, customers, honestly.
Yeah. Well,
You know?
hey, I'm not gonna fault you for the pitch yet.
No, but I think I do think that we're entering this moment where there's a bit of a divergence of mindset.
Yeah.
And you have leaders that I think even despite challenging economic times, truly believe their people are the greatest resource and asset they have. That their companies need to be diverse, inclusive, psychologically safe, and they need to create community as a pathway to achieving success.
Yeah.
And those are the folks I think, either of us speaking to, it's kind of the folks we want to be working with.
Yeah,
you
it's
know?
interesting because one of our goals next year is from a software perspective, how do we create, analytics and kind of quantify the level of connection? Because I think if you told any business leader, hey, your employees are super disconnected, and that could be between teams, that could be within your company, that could be between yourself and your customer.
Yeah.
They would be like, well, that's not good, right? And so I think there's a lot we could learn from you at Marco around like, well, how do you go about creating a system and a product that quantifies that stuff?
There might be a Marco index, which is the, sort of the new belonging measure. I mean, the old engagement survey, I think, is so antiquated, and it's inherently still rooted in this idea that people inherently don't like work and aren't working. Therefore, we need to measure their engagement as to whether they're working, giving discretionary effort to their work. So we know we need to like sunset that whole approach, and maybe there's a new model out there, that inherently speaks to like the human spirit in work, you know, and flourishing, and the, like a more nuanced sense of belonging that you guys really help enable through your platform.
Well, I think like one thing about Bain is everything was done very intentionally. So when I first got to Bain, they have associate consultant training that's always in Cape Cod. And I still remember I've like made tons of relationships that I still maintain through this one experience, but they had constructs around it. This is, by the way, before remote work was the thing. I imagine the need for that is certainly amplified. And I also think one point on frequency, which is like Culture Amp and those are great companies, but you might only do a very intense survey once a year or maybe once a quarter. Whereas now people are working more and harder. So it's hard to get a sense for how people are feeling, especially because you can't see them. Right.
Things can change in a week. They can change in a month. We definitely know they change in a quarter.
Yeah.
So you're right. If we're not like getting a real time pulse on these things, we could have major blind spots, and not learn about them and wait until way too late.
Until one of your key folks
leaves.
Yeah.
Exactly. Or there's such an issue of, a team leader, or, an issue within the organization where like a critical decision is missed because someone didn't feel safe or wasn't engaged.
Yeah, 100%. So what are you up to now other than hanging out in this?
Yeah, well, I mean, look, this is great. So I, in Exie, my last company, I'm actually a partner at an executive search firm that helps startups build leadership teams called Plenty. So we're a team of about 18 people, run by 3 ex-operators. And it's been really fun because we're in the startup ecosystem. I like to say we have a lot of the joy and none of the responsibility of helping build startups. I mean, having been operators for many years, like we know, you know the drill. I think it's the most gratifying thing in the world, and we get to be there. We've now helped over 140 companies make key hires on their leadership teams, and they're all venture backed. Some of them super early. And our whole model, and I know you know this better than anyone, is that we believe that certain leaders at certain stages of companies can be transformational to the trajectory of the business. And I've made so many mistakes not hiring the right people, or hiring the right people way too late, or not leaning on external partners to hire the right people, thinking I could just do it myself. So the whole model is, hey, let's find transformational companies, find the best possible people to help run them, and hopefully help see a lot of these extraordinary ideas come to life and grow.
Well, that's amazing. Well, this has been an awesome conversation. If you would kind of impart any last words of wisdom around kind of like how you build community at work, or any last words around your overall kind of story arc and mission, and how that's translated to your view of the workplace, perhaps.
Yeah, so I think that, I got to attend this Marco event, which, by the way, was really special. And it was, if it's anything like the experiences that you guys create for your clients, what I loved about it, what I think really like speaks to my approach with community building, is to bring vulnerability to the conversation. I feel like we're all in the spirit of like how we transact. The challenge, I think, with us transacting in these back-to-back Zoom meetings all day is that we're typically not going deep. We typically are not being patient. We're typically focusing on output and not, anything of depth, right? And you guys did a brilliant job of creating space. I think helping people slow down a little bit in New York, by the way, in the middle of one of the busiest neighborhoods in New York. And there was a real depth of vulnerability there. And I think when we as leaders, I think this is like a call to action for everyone, as either individual contributors or as leaders, when we show up in a vulnerable way, when we don't just like have a knee-jerk response to like, how are you? Great, when we show up vulnerably, we actually signal to the people around us that they can be vulnerable,
Yeah.
and that it's safe, and that you're real,
Yeah.
you know. And I think I'm amazed by like the profound impact that like vulnerability can have in any relationship, in any community that we're building.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I think even in events, people view them as transactional. Like we say experiences versus events, because you could just say, okay, we got to do a holiday party because like everyone does that and it's Christmas, or you have to do an offsite because we haven't seen each other. But we're building out something called rituals, where you're actually like do it with self-guided or with someone coming in, holding space and creating moments where you can actually talk about something that's not work. During our last team meeting, we did this one ritual where you basically see, it's called Be Seen or something like that. And you basically are looking at someone on Zoom and you're drawing them with a Sharpie without picking up your pen. And it's really funny, but then you write a word that describes them.
Wow.
And it was just this really warm kind of feeling that everyone had. And then we carried on with our meeting, right?
That's really cool.
And that would probably be the most favorite part that people will remember of that meeting.
Oh, sure. Absolutely. And you know, that's a great example of where this doesn't have to be about stopping work for an entire day. Like
Exactly.
that was a great example of a ritual that was accessible, integrated, something that was super memorable. And I mean, imagine just how that person felt by the end of all that.
Hopefully seen, right?
Seen. Yeah. So I mean, that's a great and I think that's a good thing for leaders to know, is that, you know, there are optimizations they can make, you know, to the way that they're working, that don't have to involve, you know, retreating from everything that they're doing. It's like, it's about integrating this now into what they're doing.
Well, on that note, this has been an incredible conversation.
Suman, thank you for having me. This is great.
So cheers, and
All
thanks
right,
for
man.
coming on the podcast.
Yeah.
In Ben's
In Ben's, you know, living room here. I love it.
Until next time.